Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the on the environment of this year's UK IGF. It's the first year, as I said at the start of the last session, the first year that the global IGF has been discussing the environment as a main theme, and we're following that here in Britain, and rightly so in my view. I think, as Sheetal said, this is one of the most fundamental issues that we face as a global community in this generation and the next generation. And it's really important for the internet world, the digital world, as well as other parts of economies and society to focus on it. So my thanks to Professor Miles Allen for the introductory keynote, which he gave an hour ago, in which he explained the critical importance of the climate change part of the environmental agenda, and raised some interesting ideas as to how digital corporations and digital business can contribute towards addressing it. I'll say something quickly about how I propose to run this session. So we have 4 speakers, and in a moment I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. They'll be addressing the issue from their different stakeholders' perspectives. I say 4 speakers, including myself. On the screen in a moment, you should see 4 questions that we've asked them to address. So after the introductions, I'll begin with a scene-setting presentation for the discussion, about 7, 8, 9 minutes. And then I'll invite the panelists to reflect on the first of these 2 questions. After we've done that, I'll move on to take a few items of discussion from Q&A from you online. And then we'll move on to the 3rd and 4th of those questions. So in the first, we're looking at really the priorities for industry, government, and civil society in addressing environmental aspects of digitalization. And in the second set of contributions, we'll look at, in particular, at how government, industry, and civil society, and academia and environmental researchers can work together to ensure these issues are taken more seriously and develop approaches that will work. So Sheetal introduced me sufficiently. In terms of my priorities for this issue, which is part of what I'm asking my colleagues on the panel to say in a moment, I think I would say that it's critical to me that the digital world roots its response to environmental challenges in environmental expertise. And for that, I think we need 4 things, which I'll say something about later, but we'll just mention now. I think we need greater understanding of what's happening. We need more dialogue between the digital and environmental worlds. We need the will to rethink our ways of doing things. And we need the will to re-engineer our processes in ways that put public interest and environmental sustainability alongside commercial value. And I'd say if there's one thing that climate change teaches us above all, it's that it's better to prevent or preempt problems than it is to try and fix them when they've become system critical. So that's my who I am and something about what I think my priorities are for this issue. Michelle, how about you? Could you take a minute or so to introduce yourself and say what your priorities are?
Hi, a pleasure to meet you all. So I believe that the internet should be a global public resource for all, and that it should be serving our collective liberation and our ecological sustainability, and that network itself has to be sustainable. And I agree, David, with your point about, and we need communication between internet groups and environmental groups, and that's a gap we have right now. And so to achieve these visions, I think that the people and organizations who are building and stewarding internet systems, they have to first understand the climate impact of the internet, and they have to also understand how to change it. And so I'm coming from a free and open source background, very inspired by feminism and more recently by solar punk. And I work at the Mozilla Foundation for the last decade, and I'm an advisor to the Green Web Foundation, and I'm a human on this planet.
Sorry, Jolene, I'm unmuting myself. Daniel, could you do the same? Introduce yourself and say what your priorities are in this area.
Well, thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Daniel Zeichner. I'm the Member of Parliament for Cambridge. I'm a Labour MP and I'm a Shadow Environment Minister. I represent a tech city and one which is very much in the news at the moment with the sale of one of the biggest tech companies in the country, arm to America. My interest in this is both environmental and data driven. I also chair the all-party parliamentary group on data analytics, as well as being a vice chair of the all-party group on climate change. And that group a couple of years ago did a report on exactly this issue. We called it Is Staying Online Costing the Earth? A lot of that was about the actual very direct environmental impact, literally, of just the energy we're using in all those data centers and so on. But there's the flip side to it, which is all the potential environmental benefits can be got by better production methods and so on. And I'd like to talk about both of those when we come to the main session. So thank you.
Okay, and third on the panel is Ugo. Would you like to introduce yourself, Ugo?
Hi, my name is Ugo Vallauri, and I'm co-founder and policy lead at the Restart project. Our approach and the reason we're here is very much around increasing our collective awareness that the problem with internet and the environment is not just with the infrastructure of the environment, but it's evidently about the range of devices that we use to access the internet, and whether the increased multiplication of these devices around the world is actually a cause of concern. Yes, it is. And we need to ensure that resources are not wasted, that products can last longer, they're more repairable and longer lasting, and avoiding unnecessary electronic waste.
So thank you, all three of you. That comprises our panel for the session today, or this afternoon. What I'm going to do first is to draw on the work that I've done in the past for the International Institute for Sustainable Development and for the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs to just set out some of the broader contextual issues than simply the climate change area that that Miles was talking about earlier. And I'll say something about three things. First, about the context, and then about the scale, and finally about assessment. So my aim here is simply to set out a context within which I hope will help the discussion. So first, context. I think it's important to begin here not with the digital sector, but with understanding the environmental challenge that the world's facing. And at the heart of that are three evolving crises. So there's climate change, as Miles discussed. Without rapid reductions in energy demand, we'll experience massive impacts on ecosystems and human activity resulting from changes in global temperature. There's pollution, the generation and inadequate disposal of growing volumes of redundant materials, and there's loss of biodiversity and resource depletion, so using up the stock of planetary resources. Now, the United Nations, with which I work extensively, addresses this through the concept of sustainable development, and it seeks to do so in a context of global inequality and widespread poverty, and to achieve three goals: not just environmental sustainability, but environmental sustainability alongside increased prosperity and improved social welfare. And achieving positive change across all three of those is, of course, very challenging. But that's the context for sustainable development in the UN world. Where does digital technology fit into the environmental dimension of this? So let's take a juxtaposition. Digital enthusiasts emphasize the ways in which new technologies might improve environmental sustainability, for example, energy efficiency, enabling smart systems, smart cities, and so on. Environmental pessimists stress the costs of digitalization, such as increased energy consumption and electronic waste. Now, the potential gains to the environment are significant, but relatively uncertain. The risks are also significant. Some of them are easier to quantify. A lot of what will happen in practice, we can't anticipate as yet. There will be many unexpected impacts and consequences. There are two blind alleys that environmental researchers would rather have us avoid here. So one's the temptation to go binary and to just emphasize the positives or just stress the negatives. And the other blind alley is to simply trade off the positives and negatives against each other. That's not responsible environmental governance, partly because the costs and benefits don't arise from the same factors. Both of them can be addressed, and the goals of environmentalists are therefore to maximize the potential benefits and to minimize or mitigate the potential costs. And for this area of research and study, that involves considering both specific aspects of digitalization, such as data centers, cryptocurrencies, and so on, and also taking a holistic view of the impact that the digital society, which is developing, is going to have on our societies, economies, and cultures overall. So the environmentalist view here would be, we can't afford to leave the impacts of the internet on the environment to chance or to the market, or just see what happens first and try and fix it later. That's what we're doing with the previous industrial revolutions, and it's brought us problems. Maximizing positives, minimizing negatives requires proactive action, it requires dialogue, it requires policy and intervention, it requires standards and regulatory frameworks. And you could say that's true of other contested areas of digital impact as well, like employment and equality and human rights. So second, what's the scale of the challenge from a digital perspective? At the moment, starting with climate change, at the moment, digital technologies contribute around 4% of global carbon emissions. That's considerably more than the aviation sector. The proportion's doubled in the last decade. It's expected to double again in the next 5 years, so 8% potentially in 5 years' time. It accounts for 10% of global electricity consumption within that, and that's growing at around 9% a year. And data traffic flows, they're trebling around every 5 years at present. So the upshot of all that is that at the moment, the digital sector is the fastest growing contributor to energy consumption, and therefore to carbon emissions out of any sector in the global economy. And it's that growth that matters and that requires mitigation. And it's driven by what? It's driven by the digital sector's growing importance, rapid improvements in the capabilities of digital technologies, more people using more devices for more hours in more ways every day, more processes in government and business that depend on data gathering and data traffic and data analysis. So returning to the central point environmentalists would make here, digitalization enables potential improvements and those need to be maximized, but in so doing, it generates environmental costs which need to be minimized and mitigated. There's no point wasting the gains in energy efficiency through wasteful use of energy in digital itself. Also, the digital sector is one of the fastest growing contributors to pollution. Growing volume of electronic waste, it's gone from around 35 million tons a year to around 55 million tons a year in the past decade. That rate of growth is going to accelerate. Some of it's toxic, much of it's dumped in developing countries, only about 20% is recycled. And this too is due to more equipment being used by more people, more businesses, more organizations. And there's an additional issue which is to do with the nature of technological innovation. The rapid improvements in digital capacity lead to rapid churn, to turnover in devices. We throw out old ones because they can't run the new things that our new technology enables. My iPhone was replaced just this week as an example of that. So both these challenges are certain to grow over the next decade because of the expanding role of digital. Estimates of the growth in the number of Internet of Things devices is around 30% a year. And we're on the advent of much bigger changes in digitalization, 5G networks, big data analysis, AI, machine learning, autonomous vehicles, other innovations like those, which will greatly increase the level of data gathering, analysis, and transmission. So hence again, the critical importance of mitigating negative environmental outcomes in achieving those positive environmental gains. Finally, how do we assess environmental impacts? So researchers here study the impacts of digitalization in 4 categories, or impacts on the environment generally in 4 categories, other areas too. These interact with one another, and they do so in ways that increase uncertainty, and I'll illustrate them with reference to energy. So first, there are direct impacts. So that would be the use of energy, for example, in the manufacturing processes for equipment, in running data centers, in powering computers and devices, in transmitting data traffic, in the process of machine learning. And energy use here is certain to rise because of the growing volume of all of those things. So the principle is to use mitigation. Renewables can only make part of the difference here for reasons that Miles addressed at the end of his Q&A, because the renewables are likely to, they won't take up the whole of energy production. And even if data centers globally move universally to renewable energy, as is possible within the next decade, a lot of the use of a lot of the data that is transmitted to them will be generated elsewhere in using non-renewable energy. The second, indirect impacts. That's the outcomes of how we use new technologies. Ways in which they reduce energy consumption, for example, in more efficient heating of buildings, managing traffic flows and so on. And ways they increase it because of, for example, new applications like video streaming or virtual reality. So the concern there is to maximize energy savings in other sectors and minimize the growth of energy demand in digital. And third, there are societal effects. That's the long-term changes in our societies and economies that result from the transition to a digital economy. So how we work, how we shop, how we play, where we live, how much we travel, how we do education and medicine. These are hard to predict. They will transform over time. They'll be different in different contexts and countries. We need much more foresight analysis about them. And finally, there's a fourth type of impacts that we need to understand, which are rebound effects. Because greater energy efficiency doesn't necessarily reduce energy consumption. It may well increase it. Greater efficiency reduces the cost of energy, which tends to raise demand. And also, for example, home working doesn't necessarily reduce fossil fuel consumption because homes are less efficient than offices in most cases, and people who work from home use their cars more for leisure than they otherwise would. So it's complexities like these that mean we need a holistic perspective as well as looking at specific technologies and specific applications. So I've tried to give an overview of environmentalist concerns regarding digitalization. I'll end with a personal comment based on a couple of trilogies. The first, which is a kind of mantra behind much of my work for the United Nations, is that our aim within the digital society should be to preserve what we value, promote what we want, the changes that we want to see, and prevent things that we fear. And to do this in an environmental context, I suggest we need to maximize the value of digitalization for environmental gain, to minimize and mitigate the environmental costs associated with it, and to monitor the impact which it's having on the environment in order to enable us to do those other things. So that would be my view. I think that's a sort of useful way of setting out the broad terms of what is around in discussion about the internet and the environment. And I'll now ask our panelists to make their introductory comments, particularly on these two questions. So what should be the priorities for industry, government, civil society? And what examples are there in your own context that you could give of what is happening at the moment? Michelle, could you go first, please?
Hello. Yeah, thank you, David, for that very helpful framing. That echoes with some of the priorities that I see as well, which are, if we imagine the sustainable internet, I think we're confronting threats such as a centralization of power in tech. That's some of the largest companies who are able to swiftly move to a greener infrastructure are also going to coincide with the centralization of power. And so, to your question of like, how do we preserve what we want and love about the internet? It's that it's an open internet, meaning that there's a diverse range of actors who are able to participate on it, and not a centralization there. And I think other threats are around this increased energy consumption, which you outlined, our dependency on fossil fuels. Another important aspect, I think, is misinformation and climate denial, and there's a role that the big platforms play in that. And overall, in the tech sector, a lack of understanding amongst professionals about environmental harms of their work, and then just meaningful things to do about it, to change it. And lastly, the other point, this was newer to me until Greenpeace released a report on it just recently, which is the use of big tech's AI and machine learning models to speed up oil extraction. So I think these things are, touching on different priorities when I think about the internet and the environment. What I also bring to mind is this, that from my understanding of how the trajectory of renewables is going, is that there will be a transition will happen, but it's a question of how fast. And so there's this phrase, speed is justice. And so when I think about the internet, actors on the internet, the tech industry, there's an opportunity to accelerate that transition by making their own commitments, by innovating, by accounting for your carbon legacy, for building devices for longevity and for the right to repair. And then also looking at your own investments and how to divest and to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And I also agree with this assessment that while we talk about how to reduce emissions and to mitigate, also thinking about preserving what is important and what we love about the internet. And for me, that's connecting with the importance of how the internet can be a place to inform and to organize and to advocate for change. It's also a place for us to store and to share our knowledge. And it's a place where we can be experimenting and talking about alternatives and new and responsible ways of doing things. So just then lastly, to provide some examples, those are maybe lofty concepts, but then to provide like some particular examples to give that some substance. I think the employee organizing we're seeing recently in the tech sector has been very promising. I think they're putting pressure on their companies to make more ambitious climate pledges. Amazon, Google have been recent examples of that. I think in the light after that Greenpeace report about big tech and the big oil partnerships, Google has come out with a pledge to no longer use their AI systems in that extraction. It was very specifically worded, but at least they're coming out to try to comment and to make plans to counteract that. And then lastly, there's some amazing open source projects that are trying to talk about this overall awareness and transparency around energy consumption on the internet amongst like the professional sector. And so just to highlight from the Green Web Foundation, there's a project called carbon.txt, which tries to make it possible to verify the claims about carbon neutral energy using as much of the infrastructure we already have and being human readable as well as machine readable. And I think these are really great specific efforts to address some of those priorities you mentioned.
Just to follow up quickly, Michelle, Mozilla's manifesto calls for a balance between commercial profit and public benefit in developing the internet. I just wondered whether you could say something about how, how that works out within thinking in Mozilla about and issues like the environment, particularly the environment, and whether it's different for you than it is for other companies.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the manifesto is definitely, the Mozilla manifesto helps to ground or talk about those balances. And I think we see that in, this goes back to the point I raised earlier around centralization. Mozilla believes that it's important that, that there is choice online. And when you only have a handful of providers or players, your choice is quite limited. And so I think when we talk about balancing that public interest and commercial interest, it's also how can we decentralize some of that so that other businesses have opportunities as well as users have opportunities. That might be one specific example of bringing that to life.
Daniel, can I turn to you then and ask you to talk about your priorities here, or the priorities of government, specifically actually the priorities of government and of Parliament. I hope perhaps you'll draw on the findings of the Data Analytics Committee that you mentioned earlier as well. It sounded a very interesting part of the discussion.
Great, thanks. Yes, and thank you very much for the introduction. Many of the points that you made there were things that I was going to talk about. One of the top things that strikes me is, you quoted some figures about the impact on energy use and global carbon emissions. And actually, when we did our inquiry, it was pretty striking to us that it was actually quite hard to get a handle on that data. And we heard some quite differing accounts. We also got a sense that some of the big players BT in particular made strong representations to us about the work that they'd been doing. And we could see some evidence that actually, in some cases, although it might be counterintuitive to some of us, the big players were doing better than a lot of the distributed systems in lots and lots of small data centers, or not even data centers, cupboards in buildings around the country, which were really highly energy inefficient. And this may be one of the cases actually where scale was actually helping. But I guess the conclusion we came to was that it was quite complicated. I mean, our conclusions at that time, and this is 18 months ago, it's a fast moving area. And we were taking a wider definition and not just the devices themselves, but if you take into account entertainment and media, that we reckon that it could account for 6% of global electricity and 2.4% of global carbon emissions. Your figures are quite a lot higher than that. But I think that our top conclusion was actually we wanted government to actually commit to collecting the data so that one can actually have a more informed debate. Now, of course, one of the big problems of this is that technological sovereignty is, of course, a tough question. What one does in one country, it's one of the things that struck me at times around the debate about leaving the European Union. Where is the data? You know, where is our data all the time? It's flying around the world. It's sometimes held in some data centers. We saw quite a big issue actually around that in that debate around data adequacy agreements and so on. It could still yet be a very big stumbling block, because the modern world data is perhaps one of our most important assets. But I noticed you talked about optimists and pessimists. I tend to err on the slightly more optimistic side, in a sense I do think there are many, many opportunities for we could see environmental improvement. I just cite a couple of examples in the field that I'm dealing with a lot in terms of food production. If you look at our agricultural systems, obviously huge change required to make them more environmentally sustainable, but precision farming does offer some really much more efficient use of the inputs that we are currently relying on and may rely on for some time yet. And that, of course, is very much driven by the technology which has come through in the last few years. Similarly, we've got legislation going through the UK Parliament at the moment, both on agriculture and on environment. And one of the key issues is trying to measure, establish some baseline assessments to then be able to make, to provide the right incentives and regulatory frameworks to drive improvement. Well, again, that very much relies on the kind of technology which we're talking about. So as you set out at the beginning, there are some pluses and minuses here. Just a couple of final thoughts on the governance structures, which I think parliamentarians by and large struggle with. We obviously there have been one or two UK attempts to grapple with this in recent times, not particularly successful, I'd say. We have had legislation coming through on the so-called online harms white paper. Well, that's broadly understood generally to be about the impact on users. Actually, of course, you could well argue that environmental degradation ought to be part of that as well. It has been so delayed, it's been talked about for years and years and years and keeps getting put off. But I'd argue that's an area where there ought to be some scope for some environmental interventions. And of course, in recent times, we've also had the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation set up by government. My group was a strong advocate of that. I think it would itself argue that it's not particularly well resourced given the scale of the challenge, but it is a start. And again, I think it's the kind of regulatory area where one might look for some guidance. So I would say, I mean, obviously I would say this as an opposition politician, the government isn't moving quickly enough or swiftly enough or addressing the challenge in the right kind of way. But I think I'd be generous enough to say this is hard stuff. It's not easy, but what I think also requires is international cooperation. And of course, that requires the UK to be a trusted partner. And I think I shall leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, I was wondering that maybe to follow up on one particular question, one particular point, because when you were introducing yourself a few minutes ago, you referred to your roles both in relation to data analytics and in relation to climate change within Parliament. I suspect that there aren't that many of your colleagues who have strong interests in both of those areas. Would I be right in that? If so, is there anything that you think can be done to strengthen their understanding of the sort of the interface between these things?
Very good question. I mean, there are plenty of parliamentarians who are interested in climate change. I mean, everybody ought to be, and I think everybody has a view. Far fewer people find the tech areas accessible. And frankly, I sat on the Data Protection Bill Committee, which introduced GDPR into UK law. It was pretty clear that the ministers were struggling with some of the detail. On my side of the chamber, there are 3 or 4 of us, Darren Jones, who now chairs the Bayes Select Committee, Liam Byrne, who led for Labour on that, 1 or 2 others who take a close interest. But there are a few of us, and it is one of the problems that science and technology in Parliament is always people find quite difficult. But we do have excellent advisors in Parliament. The Science and Technology Committee does a lot of good work now, headed up by Greg Clark, obviously a former Secretary of State. But you're right, that crossover between the two, there aren't many of us, so I guess I don't think I thought of it like this before. I think you're suggesting I might have a role to play, so I'll think about that.
Okay, Ugo, your turn. Can you talk about what you see as priorities? Now, I said civil society, and I know that's not really the right description for you. Your research and environmental sector focus and so on, or whatever you want to, however you want to describe it, your priorities, and maybe some examples if you have them.
Sure. Well, we are indeed a civil society in the sense that we, as part of our work, we inspire and bring together people who try with their daily efforts to prevent unnecessary obsolescence in products that would otherwise end up as waste through community repair events. We call them restart parties, others call them repair cafes. There's a global movement, and in the UK itself, it's becoming stronger. We've been running over the summer a gathering online, obviously, of all groups across the UK that are pushing in this direction with their activities. And I guess the main focus for all of us and the priority is in giving more urgency and putting pressure for change to finally happen. Because it, as you highlighted in the introduction, I mean, it's not a matter of acknowledging that there is a problem. That we all know, certainly all of us in this meeting today and many other people, that there is something that needs to happen. And in the UK, research done by the Green Alliance and partners back in 2018 highlighted that 75% of the public wants a government to take action so that products will be more repairable and longer lasting. And this is just simply happening at too slow a pace, whether in the UK and in Europe and at global level. And this has to change because, as you stated, only 20% of all the electronic waste that we produce is recycled. And little known is that for all the wonderful smartphones and other similar gadgets, the amount of recycling of all the rare metals used in them is abysmally low, at times going from 0 to 1%. So it is actually a lie that we should be recycling these devices. We should ensure that we reuse them and repair them and build them for longevity. And this is something that just isn't happening at the pace that will make it sustainable for us to continue expand our use of these technologies, which are vital for our consumption and contribution to a healthy and thriving internet. So when I can give a couple of examples just so that we put things in perspective. But when you look at, for example, smartphones, first of all, 40% of all the Android users, so let's look at Google for once, are using a device that is no longer supported software-wise, which means that they are using an unsecure device. And that's one of the reasons that people will end up upgrading to a newer device. And 40% means 1 billion people around the world. And this is ultimately a deliberate choice by the manufacturers. That's what people refer to when they talk about planned obsolescence. It's a deliberate choice by Google to stop releasing a software update for their own flagship phone one day after the 3-year period since it was released. Now, is that a sign that we should buy a new one in 3 years' time? And that's just one example. Obviously, with the multiplication of other devices, all the connected devices are often supported for an even shorter amount of time. Let's turn to Apple, remaining in the same area. Apple is a company that on the one hand is trying to claim that they're providing right to repair themselves by releasing some spare parts to some independent repair businesses in parts of the world, while at the same time they are fighting in court in Norway one-man repair business, Henrik Husby, who was doing his job of trying to extend the lifespan of products by using the parts that he could have access to, which was, in this case, screen imported from China. And by bringing this type of fear, companies such as Apple are preventing a thriving economy that would actually bring local solutions to extended reuse and repair programs for all the products that we have. This is the very company, Apple, which, this is news from yesterday, cancelled its appearance in front of the Environmental Audit Committee's inquiry on e-waste in the UK and didn't respond to a request for clarifications of why is it that they're not doing all they can to increase the lifespan of products. So these are just two examples, but the problem is really huge. And you know, I've been in conversations around electronic waste and its illegal or legal at times export to other parts of the world for over 10 years. And what's changed over time? That we haven't fixed the real problem, which is how we in the most fastest consuming part of the world, in the global north, if you want to call it that, we consume. In fact, products have shrunk in size and often become less repairable. And these are the very products that people use to access the internet. And we have not done what we need to do in terms of governments at regional and global and national level to ensure that we rebalance things and that we promote alternatives by requiring manufacturers to act on these issues. Unfortunately, voluntary action doesn't seem to happen in any meaningful way. You can't use the example of one company manufacturing very good repairable product to drive forward an agenda of repairable and long-lasting products across the world. Finally, another fact related still to smartphones that brings together issues you were relating to at the beginning with regards to the unsustainable use of resources and how little we often know about what we have in our own hands. And so between 70 and 80% of all the greenhouse gas emissions involved with the manufacturing of smartphones happen before you've ever switched the device on the first time. So there is no doubt that we need to change the longevity of these products if we want to have a real impact. And keeping in mind that some of the materials used with these devices will be in high demand for other applications, such as renewable energy projects around the world. So there is a finite amount of all of these resources, and there's a lot of possibly more urgent applications for them.
So I'm wondering here, can you think of another sector in which planned obsolescence has been replaced or displaced by an approach which extends the longevity of the devices, products, services that are provided by it.
When it comes to right to repair specifically, we have a precedent to look forward to, which is that of the automotive industry, where people have obtained more of a right to get their device, in this case, their car, repaired by any independent mechanic. It would be unthinkable for you to have to go just to one brand of mechanics in order to get your cars checked. That's just one example, although of course it's still contested. There's currently in the US very nasty campaign going on where the automotive industry is using ads to make a theoretical claim that by allowing independents to do diagnostics on the electronic aspects of cars, you're fueling the potential for sexual predators to thrive. And this is the level of desperation that part of the industry is trying to attach itself to resist what people want, freedom to do the right thing. I mean, what's kind of comforting in a way is that there's a lot more people than we are prepared to understand normally actually would like to do the right thing, but often they're prevented from doing so. And there is clearly a role for government and for industry to improve, to listen, and to actually help be more legitimate in the space.
So I'm just wondering here, Michelle, your company, Mozilla, is essentially concerned with software and applications and services. Are there ways in which it can take on some of the challenges that lead to the obsolescence of devices? I'm thinking that if the reason why we replace devices is because they're no longer capable of doing the things, the old ones are no longer capable of doing the things we now can possibly do with applications and services, is there a role for companies like yours to develop services in such a way that make that replacement of hardware less essential?
I think that's a great question. I think it goes back to one of the tenets of why Mozilla and many other organizations believe that free and open source software is incredibly important and worthy of investment, because most of those devices that Hugo was talking about, there are software dependencies that make them obsolete. There are hardware, physical things that break down, but also the software that becomes too latent, too clunky, and just starts to brick the devices. And so I think there is an opportunity to think about sustainable software practices in that way. And I think openness and open licensing becomes a key component of that. That's one of the biggest challenges not biggest challenges, but I do think that the black boxness of these devices has often been one of the reasons why you're prevented from fixing it, or there are legal instruments that prevent you from fixing it. So the licensing and the ability to see and repair and fix the code helps.
Right. I must say I'm still using bookkeeping software that I bought in 2004, which works perfectly well, and which I've been told repeatedly will not work on anything. I do have to have a computer running XP in order to run it, but nevertheless it does. Daniel, you're representing a high-tech city, so in that sense, in this question of making things last longer, reducing churn, reducing turnover, how would that go down with the high-tech firms that are surrounding the city of Cambridge?
Well, I was listening to Hugo's contribution and chuckling to myself, because we have a wonderful network of repair cafes in Cambridge. So although it is a tech city, but absolutely, many of the people I think involved in that absolutely despair at some of these practices. And I have to say, as a politician, I'm afraid this is about money, isn't it? It's about money and power. It's not about whether we can do it or not. And of course, that is, to me, the sadness of the UK moving away from a big enough, powerful enough bloc to actually take on some of these giants. I think it's going to be much harder outside. I'm constantly told by my colleagues I should stop going on about Brexit, but I do think it is a problem, because I think it's going to need legislative strength. And I think, listening to Hugo's comments, I suspect he'd bear this out. I mean, this is a real, I mean, at best an arm wrestling match, but actually it's much tougher than that. And I'm literally going to have to go and talk about the arm takeover as soon as we finish this. But you know, we're talking huge amounts of money here. You know, we think ARM in Cambridge is a big giant valued at 32 billion pounds. NVIDIA taking them over and told the market valuation is 10 times that. Now you know these are sums of money that's more than the entire UK health budget for a year. You know, this is a global challenge, and it's going to be very hard for individual countries, the UK Parliament, to have much influence on that. So I mean, it needs the EU, it needs legislators in the States as well, because obviously there's a battle going on there too, to try and correct the balance. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I had to pass up my previous mobile phone for exactly the reasons that have been described. Works perfectly well, but you know, in the end, I'm not like one of my colleagues, Chris Mullin, MP, was famously, I think, the last person in the UK to have a black and white TV license, and he was actually berated by many of his family and the rest. He said, "But I you know, I can watch the news perfectly well." Now I get that you know, most of the world wants to move on and enjoy the new services and capabilities that are there, but they shouldn't be costing the planet. And I think that was the thrust of our report. I think you were muted there.
First time I've done that, yes, I know. Ellie, I was just wondering if you could put up the second set of questions on the screen, and we can move on to those. And hopefully we can come back to some of the points that were being raised there. But to ask about this in particular, how do you think industry, government, and civil society should be measuring and monitoring the impact which digitalization is having on the environment, given the difficulties that there are? And Daniel, you were talking about the challenge of finding numbers. It's certainly hard to find numbers. And secondly, how can different stakeholders work together? This is, I think, the real challenge here, and perhaps the biggest question of this session. How can different stakeholders work together to ensure environmental issues are taken into account in the design, development, and the deployment of technology? An issue I think is important right across the board, from data centers down through to the most basic devices that individuals hold in their hands. So how can it's the working together here rather than the what's needed that I'm interested in, which is particularly relevant to the IGF, because it is a multi-stakeholder forum established by the UN on the basis that multi-stakeholder dialogue is the best way of achieving outcomes that will serve the public interest as well as commercial value and contribute towards sustainability. So let's start with Daniel. Can we start with you this time?
Yeah, thanks. I think to some extent I've touched on one or two of these things. I mean, let me do what politicians never do and say I don't know the answer, because I think it's a really big question. What I can tell you is the conclusions that the all-party group on climate change came up with. We talked about working with the International Energy Agency and the G20. Now, I'm not sure I know enough about either of the detail of how those organizations work, but it kind of goes back to my previous comment. I think that this is probably going to be hard to do within one country, and it's going to require international cooperation. So exactly as you've just been saying, it is going to be absolutely requiring cooperation at a time when one has to say politically the world looks in its least cooperative state for some time. As I think I hinted earlier, I am an optimist. I do hope that people will look back historically and see the period 2016 to 2020 as a bit of an aberration, and we can go back to trying to work collaboratively on an international scale. But that's obviously going to depend on political decisions that are made in a number of countries over the next few months. In terms of design, we also talked about a digital service standards for digital public services, and we suggested a criterion for energy efficiency by design. Again, I'm not sure I know the full detail of that, but I guess what we're saying is that, and I probably would say as a left-leaning politician, that I don't think just leaving it to the market's going to work. I think it's going to require regulatory oversight. That's not as someone who's anti-market or innovation. I just think that the market responds to the framework you set, and I think providing we can set the right frameworks, then people will respond quite innovatively in many cases. But if you stand back, then that's not going to happen. So it's a kind of fairly basic political point, but it has to be said that at the moment the politics in a number of countries aren't pointing in that direction. So there are choices. Trying to explain this to our citizens, I think, is important, because I have a hugely interested, engaged electorate in a city like Cambridge, and that will be true in many of our cities across the UK. But trying to explain to people that to get the kind of change that we all want to see is going to require a government that is of that persuasion, and then the ability to work with other governments constructively to put that in place. It's pretty hard saying that to people who want action tomorrow, because that sounds like you're prevaricating. But I have to say, my own view is that's the only way we're going to do it. But there is an urgency here, not only a public wanting urgent results. All the climate change evidence shows just how quickly we need to act. And I'm afraid every report that comes out every week shows that we're falling further and further behind. So there is an urgency.
Yes, just to take a couple of things that I'm reflecting on here, that I've written on recently. So I think back to the 1990s when I was working on the issues around the regulation of telecoms, and how at that particular time regulation was the means by which innovation was encouraged. It was a way of fostering innovation, because it pushed technology companies to do things that served a particular set of objectives, and I think it's wrong, the assessment that many people have today that regulation is actually contrary to the needs of innovation policy. I think it's a central part of it, can be a central part of innovation policy. So maybe you could each comment on that in a moment. And the other thing I would raise, I mean, the issues around the development of standards for the design of technology and services seem to me particularly crucial, and are of course a form of regulation. That we have the nonsense, I think, of the environmental aspects of Bitcoin that are not much used cryptocurrency takes up currently more energy, consumes more energy today than Switzerland, and that it's not simply that it's undesirable from an environmental point of view. It's absurd from an innovation point of view that somebody puts so much effort into designing something that is not scalable, and these kind of challenges of incorporating environmental assessment into the design and development and deployment of products, networks, services, applications, hardware seems to me to be a central question around this, and one that we were arguing for in the International Institute for Sustainable Development more than a decade ago, but which is still there. So that would be my contribution around this particular question. Ugo, can you say something about how you see people working together across the different stakeholder communities?
Well, firstly, I would agree with you that it's really, and with what Daniel said, that it is crucial that we get some sort of cooperative framework, but also that regulatory aspects should foster innovation. And I guess there's a misconception of what innovation actually means, because innovating should actually take into account the values of what we want to innovate on. And so putting planet and people at the center should not be just an option. And that's why the regulatory approach that is prevalent on products at European level is of interest, the so-called eco-design regulation, because it actually has evolved from being merely about energy efficiency in use into accounting for the material efficiency at manufacturing. And so there was this very first precedent on right to repair when, for a few initial categories of products, actually designed for repairability as well as availability of spare parts and of repair manuals to conduct repair for an extended number of years, 7 to 10 years after the last unit of that particular product will be put in the market, was approved. Now, this was approved and fought for between 2018 and 2019, and colleagues that have worked on this campaign for longer would say that it was a big milestone because they had worked on this for 5 years maybe, and it's not yet actually in effect. It will be from 2021. And as Daniel would understand very well, it's not clear yet whether this will or will not apply to the UK. But outside of the Brexit controversy, which of course is a big step back in terms of the weight that the UK can have in contributing to standards that would actually bear weight globally, it's really important that we look at how we can influence and speed up processes that are happening at European level as European legislation, hopefully positive legislation. We know there's always lots of devil in the details for these regulations, but can influence regulation for other regions of the world. And so we've seen after the approval of this initial regulation that was for things like washing machines, dishwashers, and televisions, that there was interest coming from governments and parliaments in, for example, in East Africa and in other areas of the world to see whether they could learn and adopt similar approaches. Now, what's interesting for us in monitoring is, we have a landscape of products that are largely unregulated when it comes to their repairability and longevity. And there is an opportunity to change this. There is a growing consensus around a right to repair movement. We in Europe have contributed to creating a European campaign which brings together organizations already from 15 countries that are pushing for this to happen. We've been successful at getting the European Union's to prioritize regulation of smartphones as part of their current effort. But again, not only the large manufacturers of these products are likely to put a lot of resistance to such regulatory interventions, but also they tend to take a long time. And so we're currently contributing or feeding back to a preparatory study for such eco-design regulation at the EU level, which means that if we're lucky, there might be a proposed regulation maybe in 2 to 3 years, and that if it passes, it might be in place in 5 years from now. Now, the big challenge there is if we're looking at product by product, we might be in a situation whereby by the time regulation comes into effect, there might be new categories of products that are more relevant than the products that we'll be regulating on. So I guess the urgency is around also finding horizontal measures that can go beyond the individual products, and also empowering people. I tend not to use consumers because I believe in people first, empowering people to make the right decisions when they are consuming new products. And so there's a whole current discussion on making it easier for people to prioritize products that are more repairable. So while regulation will continue to try to eliminate from the market the worst offending products, there's also a range of more or less desirable interpretation of this regulation. So where, for example, a manufacturer that decides to make every spare part of their products available to not just repairers, but to the public, and only use non-proprietary tools, and to make all their software open source, should be more visible than another that barely meets the basic requirements. So in France, there's a regulation that's been approved, legislation on waste prevention, which from 2021 will make compulsory to have a repairability score index for 5 initial categories of products. So the fact that it's possible to do it in one country, it also shows that it will be very desirable to replicate it not only in the UK, but at regional level. And you notice that when Europe, for example, has come up with these energy labels for products, actually then you start seeing them popping up on products that are sold well beyond the European single market. And so I think there is importance to be given to things that can transcend boundaries in that way and answer to concerns for people that don't necessarily have a choice to buy again another unit of a product if it fails.
Michelle, is Mozilla afraid of regulation?
No, I don't think so. And I think, as people have said here, I think regulation in a lot of these areas is needed and wanted. And you know, we've in our spheres, we've talked a lot about opportunities. For example, it's for government and civil servants to help to set an agenda. Like, I think there's Mariana Mazzucato's research center has come up with some really great examples of how there can actually be a prioritizing and a creative agenda set by government around, you know, public interest. And I think that that's something that this topic, you know, the intersection of internet and environment, can be prioritized by civil servants. There's a lot of decisions to be made at different levels. Set measurable targets for tech, to enforce them, to put requirements in procurement guidelines, to make environmental impact assessment criteria of public funding, have obligations to disclose information about emissions or environmental impact, and have that those disclosures be open formats. So to the point about this data is actually really hard to find. It's often hidden in a PDF in some, you know, website deep on a site. So these are opportunities to actually use what we've learned from other sectors around how to have these this information be disclosed in open formats, so we can actually start to build a more cohesive story around what is the environmental impact of the internet, and then what are the policy pilots that are in place to help to address those. I think when I think of it from kind of like an industry perspective, again, you know, Mozilla is kind of a funny one because it sits in a kind of a hybrid situation. But I think we're seeing in a lot of different ways that people want sustainable businesses, and there's a competitive advantage to being transparent and to being innovative on climate issues. And so I think, you know, making climate pledges, whether they're voluntary or whether there's other enforcement mechanisms to actually meet some of those targets, to actually creating, as Hugo was saying, people and planet-centric alternatives, I think that there's like a market also for that. And I see that connecting with civil society growing and amplifying and mobilizing the voices of people who want those alternatives, and to help shift the narratives of the change we want, which is, you know, so for the last decades or so, we've been under the pressure of this is all under individual choice and responsibility. And while there's choice that we need to like protect and preserve, it's also, you know, the major polluters are only in a handful of companies. And so we also need to, when we think about government, industry, and civil society working together, well, let's prioritize the main, the main culprits and work on those becoming, you know, more compliant and more efficient. So these are some of the opportunities I see. And another areas I see where these, you know, different actors can work together is around things like education. So I think there's a lot of parallels to be had. I think, for example, we need to have career paths around sustainability engineering. If you look at the tech sector today, there's really only a handful of people who know what it means to think about these issues in a practical way. But what if we actually had education, training, certificates, career pathways, incentives to become a sustainability engineer, and standards that you had to meet that were developed maybe in fora, you know, that we see that the internet uses to say, like, this is actually a standard of sustainability for the internet. We see a lot of parallels of that in things like accessibility. That becomes a kind of specialty you can have as an engineer, and it becomes also a standard that every engineer needs to think about. And so I think there's an opportunity for these different sectors to work together and say, well, let's chart that kind of sustainability engineering, you know, career path in education. Similarly in design, I think we've been talking a little bit, hinted at this, like, what is carbon aware design or demand responsive design? Like, there's also a lot we can be doing around fostering those best practices at the design level. And then lastly, I think as these multi-stakeholders, I really appreciated, David, that you brought in a climate expert into this event. And I think there's an opportunity to learn from other sectors, other expertise. How have they greened, you know, their efforts? And it's an opportunity for us, you know, narrowly looking at tech issues to also then say, well, what other expertise should we be bringing into these tables and into these collaborations? And then maybe my final concluding rally would be also to say, well, let's continue to also support the mobilization that we're seeing. So on September 25th, Fridays for Future is organizing one of their big days of action for the climate. I think there are lots of ways that in the last year when they had a big event, that companies, government, and civil society showed up in support of the young people fighting for their right to future. And I think we need to continue to be out there in a pandemic safe way, and support, you know, and support their cause as well.
So we've got about 15 minutes left before the closing of the session. There are a couple of different areas that are coming out of questions that are being put online that I want to draw on. And so one's national and the other's international. So the national context, questions raised about the digital strategy and the importance of 5G and broadband in general as part of government policy for the future of Britain. So in discussions around that, Daniel, in Parliament and within government circles, are environmental impacts discussed in that context? I'm thinking in two senses: the short-term environmental impacts, or maybe three senses: the short-term environmental impacts of what happens as networks are developed and deployed, the impacts on use of technology generally, and then the long-term potential impacts on how we live, where we live, that sort of thing, on sort of big changes in society. Are any of those or all of them being considered or not?
Well, I was actually very struck by your observation earlier that there aren't many parliamentarians who are at the intersection of these two sets of issues. And as you pose that question, I suppose it strikes me that, I mean, first thing I'd say is Parliament isn't really working very well at the moment at all anyway, because a lot of the work used to be done in kind of informal meetings and groups, which are pretty much shut because people aren't allowed on the parliamentary estate anymore. So unless there's legislation, which is never actually a particularly good place to discuss this, or it's a very big issue like testing at the moment. So, you know, there's a government minister being interrogated in the chamber. There aren't really many fora for these discussions to happen. So in my 5 years in Parliament, what I've seen is there tends to be the environmental groups who will talk about specific environmental issues, and then the techie kind of groups who will talk about, often quite in quite optimistic terms, about the tech issues. And that overlap is actually really quite rare, and it didn't happen that much before, and I don't see much sign it's happening now. I'm not privileged to be able to comment on what discussions go on in government circles. What I would reflect is that I do think the Conservatives actually stole a march on Labour in the last decade, in the sense that that they did seem to be more engaged in the tech debate than maybe the Labour Party was. And that's not entirely surprising, because the Labour Party does tend to deal far more with kind of what one might be described as day-to-day bread and butter issues: employment, schools, health, and so on. But you know, if you talk about APIs to most Labour MPs, they're not going to really know what you're talking about. Whereas there is a group of Conservatives, not necessarily their MPs, but their advisors and the think tanks, who have been working on this for some time. And you know, I hate to mention Dominic Cummings, but you know, whatever his many shortcomings may be, he certainly has been driving some thinking in these areas, which I'm not sure I've seen reflected in the other political parties in quite the same way. So I'm not sure it's a very encouraging answer to you. I think overall, I think the answer is probably not nearly enough, but that's quite true quite often in politics, which tends to be pretty short-term thinking. It's also one of the difficulties I fear for leaving the European Union, because I do think that long-term horizon scanning, thinking about these things in broader terms, was happening far more in Brussels and Strasbourg than it was in the UK. And while, you know, the Brexiteers were busy complaining we were being kind of dictated to, well, in some ways, I think the UK political culture has now got a lot of catching up to do in terms of thinking for itself about some of these issues, rather than responding to the lead, or not, as others might see it, coming from Brussels. But I think it's a problem, frankly. So I think our political culture is not helping us at the moment with this. That may not be the official line from my party, but that's my view.
At an international level, some of the questions have been concerned with the big international fora, like the World Economic Forum, for example, which has actually discussed some of these issues a bit in recent years, though has generally been very, what I would call, tech positive, focused on discussing what technology can do, in inverted commas, as opposed to what it might do in real contexts. How far can, this is a national IGF, it's participating in a global process, global United Nations IGF process. How far can national bodies like this, national sectors like that we're working in and with here, from a prominent, important, but not world lead, not in the first league that is composed of the United States and China here. To what extent can it influence things at a global level, or can its industry influence things at a global level? Firstly, in the context of the contest between American and Chinese technology, and secondly, in the kind of sense in which big ideas get developed in places like the World Economic Forum, and perhaps some UN agencies as well, and other international bodies. So that's kind of a general question, but I mean specifically in this particular area of environment and internet, environment and digital, is there expertise that we have here that we can channel into that would have some meaningful impact, given the polarization of geopolitics, given the density of international organizations? I should ask somebody.
Well, I can respond being not a UK citizen, but an admirer of the opportunity you have to influence it. I mean, to my understanding, many of the other European nations have their own IGF fora. So being maybe, you know, what is your cross-national conversation as you go into the global? And I think from following, from across the channel, I think things I've seen in the UK that have been really exciting or could be possible exports to other places are things around citizen assemblies, around climate, that I've seen. You on this call might be way more experts than I, but I think this the opportunity to actually bring citizen voices to the table in a structured manner to actually talk about what is it that we want for our neighborhood, our city, our country. And those seem like they have been a great success. And so I think that that's actually really interesting when we talk about multi-stakeholder fora and how do we think about decision-making, governance, and where do ideas come from and where do you get validation and momentum from that. I think the UK Citizen Assembly pattern is a really interesting one.
And it's one that was discussed actually a bit earlier in this UK IGF. We got about 7 minutes left for the discussion. Would either of the other two of you like to comment on that international question, the big question, the big international question?
Well, I guess just a quick one. I just wanted to say that there's been a lot of enthusiasm in international fora, such as the World Economic Forum, on this idea of a wonderful circular economy that just brings everyone happiness and all the environmental outcomes that one can dream of. But we'd like to differ. I mean, it's a concept that's been increasingly fairly completely dominated by a corporate version of the circular economy, where openness isn't really part of that conversation. And so closing the loop is seen as this mythical goal, but how we do that is still completely up for grab. And we'd like to see a change in perspective to that conversation, where it's not like the large corporations kind of dictating ways to retain value for the products they put on the market for the full life cycle of these products, but rather opening up opportunities for locally driven solutions to increase and regain value, for example, by creating local economies of repair and reuse. And I see questions on what does this all mean for the global south, for countries where there's need for extending the lifespan of products that end up there or that are destined to those markets. Well, even more so, we need to ensure that it's not just this magical idea of a circular economy where company X puts a product on the market and they will take you back maybe at the end of its lifespan, but meanwhile no one is allowed to touch it, to improve it, to service it. We need to create both versions where we might allow for multiple business models to emerge and different ideas of what does prosperity and equal access looks like.
Right. Just as a sort of final set of questions, I think one of the things that has struck me quite a lot about issues around the policy and regulatory challenges, like in my work with the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development, is that the pace of technological innovation is now so fast that we cannot learn lessons from it sufficiently quickly or enact legislative or other regulatory frameworks to shape it in the public interest until it's too late, by the time we can actually put such things in place, it has already transformed things that are happening. It's a big question to bring up at the end of the day, but it follows on from much of the discussion in a sense. How do you think we might approach that problem? This problem of the asymmetric pace of technology and governance. Daniel, I think to you.
I'm quite happy to say a little about that. It is absolutely clear, a difficult problem. But what I would say is that, and it was illustrated in a way by the whole process of GDPR and the time it took to actually incorporate that. And I and my colleagues on the Bill Committee on the Labour side, Louise Haigh and Liam Byrne in particular, were arguing that actually what was needed was a broad set of principles for the government, for the UK to be adopting, rather than to be endlessly chasing the detail. It's fallen on deaf ears so far, but and one can have a debate about what those principles might be, but I think that's the way it's going to have to be. I mean, can I just finish with one little anecdote? You raised a question earlier about whether the market was delivering what we need, and Michelle mentioned Mariana Mazzucato's work, which I think is a good framework to put it in. But I was invited by one of the tech companies based in Cambridge to see an exciting new advert they'd launched, which showed a screaming family in a very expensive looking kitchen having an argument because their child was furious because the dog had eaten one of their expensive trainers. And the answer to this apparently was a drone delivery of a second trainer within 30 minutes. Now, I think they saw a look on my face because they said, well, what do you think, Daniel? I said, well, I think you should maybe think about how you bring up your child. And secondly, I'll get rid of the dog. And that clearly wasn't the answer required. But I think that shows the kind of problem, because they were really excited about this. And okay, I get that people want things quickly. Or do they? Or are we being told they want things quickly, that there's no capacity ever to wait more than 5 minutes for anything anymore? And it may sound like a very old-fashioned negative view, but I just think, you know, we need to refocus these wonderful tech innovations to some of the really big challenges that face us, not some of the kind of narrow consumerist stuff that may shift the latest smartphone slightly more quickly. But exactly as Hugo says, there's a huge appetite out there actually for people to not indulge in endless consumerism, and I think it's the responsibility of politicians to try and find a way of addressing that. So that's my perhaps unhelpful observation at the end, but that's where I'd like to see us going.
Right. Hugo, do you think there are things we shouldn't be doing that we can do? And how do we stop ourselves? 1 minute.
Well, I guess your point, you're making the case for finding some horizontal measures that can help address some of these challenges, kind of irrespective of specific individual silos of specific technology. And that's what I was hinting at in bringing, I guess, transparency and openness with regards to better information about what manufacturers adhere to or commit to in terms of long-term support, and unlocking the information imbalance. There's a question by Henriette in the list that asks, okay, well, is there growing demand for this type of products? There certainly is, but people often are unable to make a really easy, informed decision. And openness and removing barriers to actually verifying that claims are not just greenwashing by manufacturers is an important step that governments can facilitate.
Michelle, you get the last word.
Well, let's continue to push this topic, not only at the national IGFs, but globally, also in the COP conversations. And, as I think we're seeing, there is an appetite to link these different perspectives to articulate what it is that we think is desirable and how we're going to get there. And so actually, I just want to express gratitude to the organizers of the IGF for making space for this topic. I think it's incredibly important, and I think we need to keep pushing it.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you all of you for what I think has been a really interesting hour and a half of discussion around this. It's been a pleasure spending time with you, and I hope you have a good rest of the